The wind howled outside as Sarah and her family pulled up in front of their new home. It was an old Victorian house, nestled at the edge of a quiet town. The architecture was beautiful. Tall, majestic windows, a large wooden door, and a front porch that seemed to invite visitors inside. To Sarah, it felt like a dream come true. For months, she had searched for a place that would feel like home. And now, after weeks of anticipation, she was finally here. "Isn't it perfect?" Sarah asked her husband, James, who was unloading boxes from the car. "It's beautiful, no doubt," James replied, his voice a bit more subdued. "But there's something off about it. I don't know, maybe it's just the size of it." Sarah laughed and brushed off his concern. "You're just nervous. It's going to be fine. This house has character. We're starting a new chapter here." Their two children, Emma and Noah, ran around the yard, excited by the vastness of the space. Sarah couldn't help but smile. She had always wanted a large home, a place where her kids could play freely and where she could build lasting memories. The house had been on the market for months, and despite its age, it was in perfect condition. No leaks, no visible damage, nothing to suggest that anything could be wrong. As they stepped inside, the cool, musty air greeted them. The floors creaked under their feet, and the walls seemed to whisper in a way that Sarah couldn't quite explain. It was as if the house had a life of its own, a heartbeat that pulsed through the floors and walls. "James, look at this place," Sarah said, her voice filled with awe. The grand staircase spiraled upwards, and the high ceilings made the house feel open and airy. The living room was filled with sunlight streaming through the tall windows, casting long shadows on the floor. It was perfect. James wasn't so sure. He stood at the base of the staircase, eyes narrowed, scanning the space. There was a peculiar chill in the air that seemed to linger, making him uneasy. "Let's check out the rest," he said, pushing his feelings aside. He didn't want to ruin Sarah's excitement, but something about the house felt wrong. The first few days were filled with excitement and activity. The boxes were unpacked, furniture was arranged, and the family settled into their new routine. But as the days passed, the house began to feel less like a home and more like a place they couldn't quite understand. At night, Sarah would lie awake in bed, the floorboards creaking beneath her. She would hear whispers low and distant, as if someone or something was walking around the house. She would tell herself it was the house settling, the wind making noise, but deep down, she knew it wasn't. There was something else at work here, something she couldn't quite place. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Sarah stood at the window in the living room, gazing out into the darkening yard. The wind was picking up again, sending the trees swaying. She thought she saw something move in the corner of her eye, a shadow passing across the yard, too fast for her to catch. Her heart skipped a beat. She turned quickly, but the house was silent again. "James, did you see that?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. James, who was in the kitchen, didn't answer immediately. When he finally walked into the room, he seemed distracted, his eyes unfocused. "What?" he asked, looking at her with a confused expression. Something just moved outside. I swear I saw it." James walked over to the window and peered out, his brow furrowed. "It's probably just the wind. The trees can look funny in the dark." But Sarah wasn't convinced. Something wasn't right, and she could feel it in her bones. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Sarah sat in the living room alone, trying to shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her. She sat in the armchair near the fireplace, the soft glow of the flames casting eerie shadows across the walls. The house was quiet, too quiet. She could feel the weight of something watching her. But when she turned her head, nothing was there. Still, The sensation lingered, creeping along her skin like cold fingers brushing against her neck. As she sat there, a strange noise came from the hallway, the sound of footsteps. Light at first, then growing louder and closer. Sarah's heart began to race. She stood up, her breath caught in her throat. The footsteps were unmistakable. They were too real, too heavy to be the house settling. Sarah slowly made her way toward the hallway, her footsteps quiet against the wooden floor. She turned the corner, but there was no one there. Only darkness and the faint scent of something old and musty. "James?" she whispered, but there was no answer. She could feel the air grow colder, the whispers from before growing louder in her ears. It was as if the house itself was trying to communicate with her, warning her of something she wasn't ready to understand. But what? The hairs on her neck stood up as she slowly backed away from the hallway, heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew one thing for sure. This house wasn't what it seemed, and it wasn't going to let them leave so easily. The next few days felt like a blur. The house, which had once seemed so perfect, now felt oppressive, like it was watching them, waiting for something. Sarah couldn't shake the strange feeling that had settled over her, and it seemed to get worse each night. One evening, after dinner, Sarah was sitting in the living room, going over some old family photos. The house was quieter than usual, and the silence felt heavy, pressing in on her. Suddenly, she heard it again, the soft, slow creak of footsteps coming from the second floor. She froze. Her heart started to race. "James?" she called, but there was no response. She looked toward the staircase, her eyes scanning the dark shadows at the top. The footsteps grew louder, closer, as if someone was walking down the stairs. She felt her breath catch in her throat, but there was no one. She stood up slowly, her legs shaky as she made her way toward the stairs. Each step she took felt like it echoed in the empty house. The air was cold, colder than it had been all day. Sarah felt goosebumps rise on her skin as she reached the bottom of the stairs, her gaze fixed on the dark hallway above. The whispers started then, soft at first, like a distant murmur, but growing louder with each passing second. She couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like something was talking to her. The voice was low, hoarse, as if it was coming from deep within the house itself. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath. "James?" she called again, her voice trembling. Still no answer. She took a few more steps up the stairs, her pulse pounding in her ears. As she reached the landing, the whispering stopped. The silence was almost worse than the sound. She felt like she was standing in the middle of something ancient, something dark and powerful that was just waiting for her to make a mistake. Suddenly, she heard the unmistakable sound of a door opening. Her heart skipped a beat. She spun around, looking for James, but he wasn't there. The door to the attic, one she had never noticed before, was now slightly ajar. Without thinking, she moved toward it, her hands trembling as she reached for the doorknob. The cold metal sent a shock through her fingers, and she hesitated for a moment, unsure if she should go any further. But something pulled her in, a force she couldn't explain, a need to understand what was happening to them. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading up into darkness. The air smelled musty and old, like it hadn't been touched in years. She hesitated, but then the whispers came again, louder now, urging her forward. "Sarah?" The voice was soft but clear this time, and it sent a chill down her spine. "Come, find me." Her breath caught in her throat. It was as if the house was calling to her, like it knew her name. She took a deep breath and began to climb the stairs, each step creaking under her weight. The higher she went, the colder it became. The whispers grew louder, the words becoming clearer, but still, they made no sense. "Sarah?" The voice was right behind her now, so close she could feel its breath on her neck. She spun around, but there was nothing there. No one. Her heart raced in her chest, and she grabbed the railing, trying to steady herself. The attic door at the top of the stairs was now wide open, beckoning her in. Without another thought, she stepped forward. The attic was massive, filled with old furniture and dusty boxes. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of age and decay. But it wasn't just the smell that disturbed her. It was the feeling, the sense that she was not alone. There, in the corner of the room, was a large, old-fashioned mirror. It was tall, framed in dark wood, and had a strange, almost lifelike quality to it. Sarah found herself drawn to it, her feet moving toward it against her will. As she approached, she felt the temperature drop even further. The room was colder than any part of the house she'd been in. She reached out to touch the mirror's surface, her fingers trembling, and that's when she saw it. In the reflection, she saw herself, but not as she was now. The woman in the mirror was different. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. She looked as though she was screaming, but no sound came from her lips. Behind her, a shadow moved, something dark and formless, its shape constantly shifting. Sarah pulled her hand away, her breath coming in short gasps. She turned to run, but before she could make it to the door, she heard a sound. A low growl, like the rumble of an animal, coming from the farthest corner of the attic. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her legs felt like jelly. She bolted out of the room, slamming the attic door shut behind her. But the growl continued, echoing through the walls of the house. She ran downstairs, her mind spinning, the weight of what she had just seen heavy on her shoulders. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, she looked up and saw James standing in the hallway, his eyes wide with confusion. "Sarah, what's going on?" he asked, his voice full of concern. I don't know," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "There's something in this house, James. Something evil." But even as she spoke, she knew that there was no going back. The house had already claimed them, and it wasn't going to let them leave. The whispers were getting louder again, closer. The next morning, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to her like a shadow. The house felt different, as if something was moving just out of sight, something she couldn't quite grasp. She hadn't slept much that night, her mind racing with what she had seen in the attic. The growl, the shadow, and most of all, the mirror. Its reflection still haunted her. James had noticed her unease, of course, but he didn't understand. He thought it was just the stress of moving to a new place. He tried to reassure her, but his words felt hollow, like they were being swallowed by the house itself. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said quietly over breakfast. "This place isn't right, James. I can't explain it, but something's wrong." James frowned, his face creased with worry. "Sarah, you're just tired. We've been through a lot. Maybe you just need a good night's sleep." But Sarah didn't feel tired. She felt alert, wide awake, and on edge. She had never felt so certain that something terrible was waiting for them, something that would make itself known sooner or later. Later that day, as they were unpacking boxes, Sarah noticed a strange marking on the wall near the staircase. At first, she thought it was just a scratch, but as she got closer, she realized it was more like a symbol, carved into the wood. It was faint, but the edges were sharp, as if it had been made recently. She reached out to touch it, but before her fingers made contact, she heard a loud crash from upstairs. Startled, she jumped back and looked at James, who was standing across the room. "What was that?" Sarah asked, her voice shaky. "I don't know," James replied, his face pale. "Stay here. I'll check." But Sarah wasn't about to stay put. She followed James up the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. As they reached the top, they found nothing, no sign of anything unusual. The hallway was empty, the room silent. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. As they walked past the bedroom, Sarah froze. The door to the attic was open again, wider than before. She could feel the cold air spilling out from the stairs, and the whispers seemed to grow louder, like they were calling her name. "James?" Sarah whispered, but her voice trembled. James didn't seem to notice. He was already moving toward the open door, but before he could take another step, the door slammed shut with a force that made the walls shake. They both jumped back, fear gripping their hearts. The house seemed to groan, like it was alive, reacting to their presence. For a moment, there was only silence, thick, suffocating silence. Then, from the shadows of the hallway, a figure appeared. It was a woman. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and hollow, staring at them without blinking. Her hair hung in matted strands around her face, and her clothes were torn and stained. She didn't speak, but her presence was enough to send a chill through Sarah's bones. Before Sarah could react, the woman stepped forward, her feet making no sound against the floor. Sarah backed away, her heart racing, but the woman didn't seem to be moving toward them. Instead, she was staring at the attic door, as if waiting for something to happen. The whispers grew louder, now filling the entire house. The air around them seemed to thicken, pressing in from all sides. James grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her back toward the stairs. "We need to leave," he said urgently, his voice shaky. Now, they rushed downstairs, and as they reached the living room, the front door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Sarah turned back to the window, but there was no sign of anything outside. It was as if they were trapped, locked inside the house with no way out. James grabbed his phone, his hands trembling as he tried to dial. But the signal was gone. No bars, no connection. "This isn't happening," James muttered under his breath, pacing the floor. There has to be a logical explanation for all of this. But Sarah knew better. She had seen the woman, and she had felt the house shift around them. There was no explanation. The house was alive, and it wasn't going to let them go. The woman in the hallway appeared in the corner of Sarah's mind, her empty eyes staring at her as if she knew something Sarah didn't. She had to understand what was happening. They both did. But first, they had to survive the night. The night stretched on longer than Sarah ever thought possible. She and James sat in the living room, too afraid to move, too afraid to sleep. Every small sound, every creak of the floorboards, sent their hearts racing. The woman's ghostly image lingered in Sarah's mind, her hollow eyes burning into her thoughts. "I don't think we can stay here any longer," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the eerie silence that seemed to fill the room. James didn't answer right away. He was staring at the walls, his mind racing. The house felt like it was pressing in on them, like it was watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake. "I'll go check the attic," he said finally, his voice shaky but determined. "No!" Sarah cried, grabbing his arm. "We can't go back up there. The house, it's not just a house. There's something in it. Can feel it." James tried to pull his arm free, but Sarah held on tightly. "We can't just sit here and do nothing. If we don't find out what's going on, we'll never leave. We'll be trapped in this place forever." Sarah's words hit James hard. He knew she was right, but the thought of going back up into the attic, where all the strange things had started, was terrifying. Still, he couldn't ignore the fear in her eyes. Something had to be done. With a reluctant sigh, he pulled away from Sarah and grabbed a flashlight from the drawer. "Stay here. I'll be quick." Sarah watched him leave, her heart pounding as she heard the sound of his footsteps on the stairs. She hugged her knees to her chest, praying he would be safe. The whispers from the attic had grown louder in the past hour, now sounding almost like voices, no longer just random sounds. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. A few moments later, Sarah's phone buzzed. She picked it up quickly, but it was only a text from James. "Come up here, Sarah. You need to see this." Her heart skipped a beat. She hesitated for only a moment before grabbing the flashlight herself. She knew she couldn't ignore his message. But what could he have found up there? And why was he asking her to come up now? Shaking, she made her way upstairs, the beam of light from the flashlight trembling in her hand. As she reached the top of the stairs, she felt the air grow colder. The attic door was wide open again, the stairs leading up to it black as night. She hesitated, but then she heard James's voice, weak and distant. "Sarah? Please. You need to see this." Her heart thudded in her chest as she stepped toward the attic. The door slammed shut behind her with a loud crash, causing her to jump. The only sound she could hear now was her own breath, shallow and fast. She turned the doorknob slowly, pushing it open. The attic was dark and dusty, the air thick with the scent of mildew. Sarah's flashlight beam swept over the old furniture, boxes, and forgotten belongings. But there was no sign of James. Her pulse quickened. "James?" she called softly. Nothing. Then her flashlight caught something. At the far end of the attic, there was a large mirror leaning against the wall. The same mirror she had seen earlier, the one that had shown her that dark figure. But now it was different. There was something inside the reflection. Figure. James stood in front of the mirror, his back to her, staring at something in the reflection that she couldn't see. "James!" Sarah cried out, rushing toward him. He turned around slowly, his face pale and strained. His eyes were wide, as if he had seen something that shook him to his core. "Sarah, you need to leave," he said, his voice trembling. "We're not alone here." Before Sarah could respond, the lights in the attic flickered. The whispers returned, louder this time, and Sarah felt the temperature drop even further. It was as if the house was closing in on them, the walls pressing in with a terrible force. James stepped back, his eyes locked on something in the corner of the room. Sarah followed his gaze and saw a shadow, slowly growing larger, moving toward them. The shadow was no longer just a shape. It was something else, something with depth, with presence. It was alive. "Sarah," James whispered, his voice breaking. "Run. Now." But it was too late. The shadow lunged at them, a dark, twisting mass of smoke and rage. Sarah screamed as she tried to pull James back, but the shadow grabbed hold of them, pulling them toward the mirror. The reflection distorted, showing the house, but it wasn't the house they knew. It was a different place, an old, crumbling mansion with endless halls and dark corridors. And at the center of it all was the woman. She stood there, staring at them from the reflection, her hollow eyes filled with a silent warning. The house was not just haunted, it was alive, and it was hungry. Sarah's heart raced as the shadow in the attic pulled her and James closer to the mirror. She felt a cold grip on her arm, like something unseen was trying to drag them into the reflection. The room seemed to spin as the house groaned and shifted around them. It was no longer just a house. It was alive, twisting and suffocating them. James struggled to break free, his face pale and filled with terror. "We have to get out, Sarah. This place is trying to trap us." But it was too late. The shadow reached them, and in the next moment, everything went dark. When Sarah opened her eyes, she was no longer in the attic. She was standing in a dimly lit hallway, with faded wallpaper peeling from the walls and an eerie silence that pressed against her ears. She glanced around, panic rising in her chest. This wasn't the house she knew. This place felt wrong. "James," she called, her voice shaking. She tried to move, but the air around her seemed thick, as if she were wading through water. She looked down at her hands, but they were faint, like they weren't fully there. "Sarah?" The voice came from behind her. She turned quickly, and there was James, his form blurry and almost transparent. "James!" she cried, reaching for him, but her hand passed right through him. "Sarah, listen to me." James's voice was strained. "We're not in the same world anymore. This place, it's not real." Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she looked around. The hallway stretched endlessly, its shadows moving like living things. The faint whispering from before was now a constant hum, growing louder with each step she took. "No, no, this can't be happening," she whispered to herself, tears welling in her eyes. "Where are we? What is this place?" James's form flickered, his face showing the pain of the truth he couldn't escape. "This is the house's true form, Sarah. It's not just haunted, it's a doorway. A doorway to something far darker." Sarah took a shaky step back. "A doorway? To where?" "To a place the house wants us to stay forever," James said, his voice distant. "It wants us trapped in its memories, in its past." Suddenly, the hallway seemed to grow darker. The walls closed in, and the whispers became clear. They weren't just whispers. They were voices, speaking in a language she didn't understand. The temperature dropped, and Sarah could see her breath in front of her, fogging in the air. "James, we need to get out," she cried, but he was gone, disappeared just like before. Panic surged through Sarah as she ran down the hallway, but every door she tried to open was locked. Every room she entered was empty, cold, dark, and filled with the sound of her own racing heart. The house seemed to stretch on forever, an endless maze with no way out. Then she heard it, the faint sound of footsteps behind her. She spun around, but no one was there, only the shadows moving in the corners of her vision. "Sarah?" The voice again, clearer this time. It was a woman's voice, low and filled with sadness. "Sarah, you can't escape." Sarah froze, her blood running cold. She turned slowly and saw the figure standing in front of her. It was the woman from before, the one she had seen in the reflection. But now she wasn't just a shadow. She was real, standing in front of Sarah with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. "No, no, please," Sarah begged, stepping back. "What do you want from me?" The woman didn't answer. Instead, she stepped forward, her movement slow but deliberate. Sarah's breath quickened as she felt the air grow colder around her. The woman reached out, touching Sarah's cheek with a hand that was ice cold. "This house was never yours," the woman whispered, her voice like the wind through dead trees. "You belong to it now, forever." With those words, the woman vanished, leaving Sarah standing alone in the hallway. The walls seemed to close in on her, and the ground beneath her feet felt unstable, as if it could crumble away at any moment. The whispers grew louder, drowning out everything else. Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She ran, but the hallway stretched on forever, mocking her every step. Just as she thought she couldn't run any longer, she saw a door at the end of the hallway. It was open, a sliver of light spilling out from the cracks. Without thinking, she bolted toward it, her pulse pounding in her ears. As she reached the door, she was pulled inside. The room was small, the walls covered in old, peeling wallpaper. The window was cracked, and the light that shone through seemed dim, like it was fading. But what caught Sarah's attention was the mirror on the far wall. It was the same one she had seen earlier, the one that had trapped them all. She stepped toward it, drawn to it, unable to stop herself. And as she did, she saw something that made her blood run cold. In the reflection, there was a figure standing just behind her. It was James, but this time his eyes were hollow, his face pale and lifeless. He reached out to her, his mouth moving, but no sound came. "James?" Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. The figure in the mirror smiled, and Sarah knew, without a doubt, that it wasn't him. It was the house, feeding on them, trying to claim them as its own. And then the mirror shattered. The mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces, but the horror didn't end. The sharp sound of breaking glass echoed through the room, filling Sarah's ears with a painful ringing. She stood frozen, staring at the jagged shards scattered on the floor, her breath coming in quick gasps. But something was wrong. The air felt heavier, the temperature dropping even further. The shadows in the room seemed to grow longer, moving like living things. And then, a cold voice whispered from behind her. "You're not leaving." Sarah spun around, but there was no one there. The voice seemed to come from everywhere, pressing in on her from all sides. Her heart pounded in her chest as she backed away from the mirror, the shards still glowing faintly in the dim light. She tried to run, but the floor beneath her feet felt like it was pulling her back, as if the house itself was refusing to let go. The walls seemed to close in, narrowing with each step she took. Suddenly, the door she had come through slammed shut. Sarah's panic rose, her breaths coming faster as she tried to pull it open, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the house had sealed her in. "No, no!" she screamed, pounding on the door with her fists. But no one could hear her. The house was alive, and it was trapping her, tightening its grip. Her mind raced. She needed to find another way out. She turned to face the room again, the flickering shadows now surrounding her. The walls seemed to be closing in, and the whispers grew louder, their voices distorted, like a chorus of people all speaking at once. "Get out! Get out!" they hissed. "You belong here, forever." The floor beneath her feet creaked, and Sarah's eyes widened as the ground began to shift. A crack appeared in the wooden floor, splitting wide open, revealing a dark pit below. Without thinking, Sarah jumped back, her heart hammering in her chest. But the shadows followed her, pushing her toward the opening. She felt an icy chill wrap around her ankles, pulling her toward the edge. "No!" she cried out, but the darkness was stronger. In that moment, the figure she had seen in the mirror, James, appeared once more, but this time, he wasn't a reflection. He was standing right in front of her, his eyes hollow and empty, his face pale and lifeless. "Sarah," his voice was weak, filled with an unnatural sorrow. "You have to leave. It's too late for me." "But it's not too late for you." Her heart clenched. She reached out to him, but he stepped back, his form flickering in and out of focus. "This house," James whispered, his voice fading, "it's feeding on us. We can't escape. But you can still run. You have to, before it's too late." But before she could say anything, he disappeared into the shadows. The darkness was closing in, swallowing everything around her. Sarah's chest tightened as she felt the weight of the house pressing down on her. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. All she could do was watch as the darkness consumed everything she had known. And then, the floor beneath her feet gave way. She fell into the pit, plunging into the suffocating darkness. Sarah landed hard on the cold, unforgiving ground. Her head spun as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. Her mind was a blur of fear, confusion, and despair. But when she looked around, she realized she wasn't in the same room anymore. The place was vast, endless, like a cavern deep underground. The walls stretched high above her, twisted and gnarled like ancient trees. The air was thick, heavy, and smelled of decay. The shadows seemed to move, crawling along the walls like something alive. "This place," Sarah whispered to herself, her voice echoing in the silence. "It's not real." But even as she said it, she knew it was. The house had swallowed her whole. It had trapped her in this nightmare, and now there was no way out. She stood up, her legs weak beneath her. Her eyes darted around, trying to find any sign of escape, but the darkness stretched out in every direction. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, everything seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as if the very structure of the place was alive. "Sarah?" The voice came again, soft and distant, but this time it wasn't James. It was something else, something older, something more sinister. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the shadows in front of her began to twist and shape into something. Someone. She stepped back, her heart pounding in her chest, as the figure in the darkness slowly took shape. It was a woman, a tall, gaunt figure with hollow eyes and a mouth twisted into a grimace. Her skin was ashen, her hair long and wild, like something that had been lost for centuries. The woman's voice echoed through the cavern. "You're here now, Sarah. You'll never leave." "No," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "No, I won't stay here. I'll find a way out. But before she could finish, the ground beneath her feet trembled. The walls shifted again, closing in on her, trapping her in a circle of darkness. "You don't get to leave," the woman hissed, her voice like the sound of dry leaves rustling. "You belong here in the house, with us." Sarah could feel the coldness seep into her bones, but she refused to give in. She couldn't. Not after everything they had been through. She had to fight. She had to survive. With all the strength she had left, Sarah turned and ran, her feet pounding against the cold ground. She didn't know where she was going, but she couldn't stop. She wouldn't. The shadows were closing in on her, but she wasn't going to let them win. She couldn't. Not when there was still a chance. And so she ran. Sarah ran through the darkness, her breath sharp and shallow. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her mind raced as she tried to make sense of everything. The shadows seemed to follow her, slithering along the walls, reaching for her like cold hands. The woman, the dark figure who had spoken to her, was still out there, her voice echoing in Sarah's mind. "You belong here," it whispered again and again. But Sarah refused to listen. She couldn't. She had to get out. She stumbled over the uneven ground, her feet slipping on the slick surface, but she kept running. Her eyes darted around, looking for anything that might help her escape. The dark, twisted walls seemed to close in around her, the air growing colder with each step she took. Then, in the distance, she saw something. A faint light, flickering like a distant star. Her hope flickered with it. Was it real? Was it the way out? Without thinking, Sarah sprinted toward it, her legs aching, but the light seemed to move farther away as she got closer. The shadows reached out, trying to drag her back, but she pushed on, determination in her eyes. The light grew brighter, and she could hear a faint sound, like a door creaking open. Hope filled her chest. This was it, the way out. But as she reached the source of the light, her stomach dropped. It wasn't a way out. It was a doorway, but not the kind she had hoped for. The light was coming from an old, wooden door, but the markings on it were strange. Twisted symbols that she couldn't understand. The door seemed to breathe, as if it was alive, its wooden surface shifting under her gaze. Sarah hesitated. Should she open it? Was this the escape she had been searching for? Or was it another trap? The whispers grew louder, surrounding her. "Open it. Come to us." She closed her eyes, her mind screaming at her to run. But something deep inside her told her that this was the only way. She had to face whatever was behind that door. She had no choice. With a shaking hand, she reached for the handle. The cold metal sent a jolt through her as her fingers curled around it. She took a deep breath and pulled. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a blinding light that filled the room. The shadows recoiled from the light, as if they were afraid of it. Sarah stepped forward, her body trembling, but she couldn't stop herself. As soon as she stepped through, she felt the air change. It wasn't cold anymore. It wasn't dark. She could breathe again. The oppressive weight that had been pressing down on her vanished. The house, if this even was the house, was gone. She blinked, trying to adjust to the brightness. The surroundings seemed normal. It was a quiet, peaceful room, as if nothing terrible had happened. But Sarah wasn't fooled. "Where am I?" she whispered to herself. The door slammed shut behind her with a loud thud, but she didn't turn around. She had to keep moving. She wasn't free yet. There had to be something more to this place. Suddenly, the floor beneath her feet rumbled. A deep, growling sound filled the air. The walls shook, and the room began to warp, the peaceful surroundings twisting into something unnatural. The light flickered and dimmed, casting eerie shadows that danced on the walls. And then she saw it. The same woman, gaunt and ghostly, stepped out of the shadows. Her hollow eyes locked onto Sarah's, and her mouth twisted into a smile. "You can never leave," the woman hissed. "You're trapped, just like the others." Sarah froze. The door had been a trap. The house wasn't just a place. It was a prison, and no one ever escaped. But she wouldn't give up. She couldn't. The woman's words didn't matter. Sarah had to fight. She turned to run, but the walls closed in on her, pressing her back toward the woman. The room was closing in, and there was nowhere to go. "You will join us," the woman whispered. "You will be one of us." Suddenly, everything went dark. When Sarah opened her eyes again, she was back in the house. It was like she had never left. The walls were the same, the shadows were the same, and the whispers filled the air. But this time, she was different, stronger. The fear that had consumed her was gone. She had faced the darkness and survived. Now it was time for her to take control. The house wanted to consume her, to keep her trapped in its twisted embrace. But Sarah had a secret now. She knew the truth. The house fed on fear, and as long as she was afraid, she would remain trapped. But if she could face the fear head-on, if she could take away its power, the house would have no hold on her. With a deep breath, Sarah stood tall. She wasn't going to run anymore. The shadows lunged at her, but she faced them, her mind clear and determined. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," she said, her voice steady and firm. And with that, the house screamed. The walls cracked, the floor shook, and the darkness swirled around her. But Sarah stood her ground. She could feel the house fighting against her, trying to pull her in, but she refused to let it. She had faced the worst of it, and now she was free. With a final roar, the house collapsed in on itself, the darkness fading away. The whispers fell silent. Sarah opened her eyes to see the sunlight streaming in through the windows. The house was gone. It was over. She was free.